Step back. Hands where I can see them. The officer's voice exploded through the bustling noise of the airport terminal, sharp and commanding, slicing through the air like a blade. It wasn't just loud, it was deliberate, designed to draw attention. Heads turned instantly, conversation stopped mid-sentence, and the natural hum of a busy airport came to a screeching halt. The woman froze, her body stiffening as every pair of eyes seemed to lock onto her. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had come to a standstill, leaving only her and the officer in the spotlight. She stood near the security checkpoint, dressed professionally, her heels clicking against the polished floor just moments before the confrontation. She had been in a hurry, her mind preoccupied with the time, knowing her flight was boarding soon. But now, that urgency was drowned out by something much heavier, a sinking weight that gripped her chest. I said hands up. Now. His voice boomed again, echoing off the high ceilings, making her flinch. For a second, she didn't move. Her brain struggled to process what was happening, to connect the dots between her rushing through security and suddenly becoming the center of attention in a scene that felt like it belonged in a bad movie. Her eyes darted to the people staring, some whispering, others raising their phones to record. She slowly lifted her hands, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Sir, don't talk." His voice cut her off like a whip, sharp and unyielding. "Turn around. Face the wall." Confusion collided with anger inside her, but she bit it back. She had dealt with people like him before, loud, authoritative, and quick to judge, but this was different. This was public. This was humiliating. She took a step back, her heels clicking too loudly in the silence. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice calm but strained, trying to keep control. But the officer wasn't listening. "Turn around now." He grabbed her by the shoulder, spinning her roughly so that her back hit the cold wall. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but no one stepped forward to stop him. She felt the heat rise to her face as her breath caught in her throat. The officer's hand pressed against her back, forcing her against the wall as though she were armed and dangerous, as though she hadn't spent her entire career protecting this country, protecting people like him. "You have no idea who I am," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Oh, I know exactly what you are," he sneered, leaning in closer. His words were laced with disdain, and his breath reeked of coffee. "You're just another one of them trying to act like you belong here." Them. The word hit her like a slap, heavy and sharp, full of judgment and venom. She felt her stomach churn, but she refused to let him see her break. The officer reached for her purse and snatched it from her shoulder, dumping the contents onto the floor with no regard for the personal items spilling out. Lipstick rolled across the tiles. Keys jingled. A phone screen flashed as it hit the ground. And then there was the badge. It fell last, landing face up, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The officer's eyes locked onto it, his breath catching audibly. The seal. The letters. The title. CIA. The badge stared back at him like an accusation, like proof that his assumptions had been wrong, terribly, disastrously wrong. But it was too late. The damage was already done. The crowd had seen everything, the way he shoved her, the way he manhandled her, the words he spat like venom. Phones were still recording, capturing every detail. The woman stepped forward, reclaiming the authority he had tried to strip from her. Her eyes were sharp now, cutting through his panic. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked, his voice suddenly weaker, the arrogance starting to crack but still hanging on like a thread. She didn't flinch. "Pick it up and read it." His hands trembled as he reached down, lifting the badge as though it might burn him. He turned it over, his face draining of color as he read the name and title printed in bold letters. "Ma'am, I didn't." "No," she cut him off sharply, stepping closer. "Don't ma'am me now. You didn't have a problem disrespecting me a minute ago." His mouth opened, then closed again. He looked around, suddenly aware of the dozens of eyes still watching him, of the phones still recording. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. She's CIA. Did he just do that? What's going to happen to him now? The officer shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders tightening under the weight of their judgment. The woman didn't let up. Her voice sliced through the tension like a blade. You put your hands on me. You humiliated me. You treated me like a criminal because of the way I look. And now you think an apology is going to fix this? The crowd moved in closer, drawn by the confrontation, by the raw emotion hanging in the air. The officer's face flushed red, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. You don't know who I am, she said again, her voice steady but burning with controlled anger. You will. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, exposed and powerless in front of everyone. But what happened next? What came after this shocking moment that left an entire airport in stunned silence? Stay with us, because this story is only getting started. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in all its forms. This channel is a safe space for powerful stories that shed light on important issues while inspiring change. To all our Black viewers, we see you, we support you, and we honor your strength and resilience. Now, sit back and enjoy this emotional and impactful story filled with twists and turns. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support our work. Let's dive in. The airport hummed with the restless energy of travelers coming and going. Children clutched stuffed animals while parents herded them through security lines. Businesspeople balanced coffee cups and rolling luggage, their eyes fixed on phones and departure boards. The smell of burnt espresso and recycled air clung to every corner, mixing with the faint scent of cleaning products and the metallic tang of tension that airports always seem to carry. Amid the crowd, a woman moved with quiet purpose. Her heels clicked against the polished tile floors, a steady rhythm that matched the deliberate pace of someone who was used to commanding a room without raising her voice. Aaliyah Bennett had spent her life perfecting the art of composure. Her dark skin glowed under the harsh fluorescent lights, a contrast to the sleek gray suit that hugged her figure like armor. Her short, natural curls framed high cheekbones and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She wasn't just confident, she was practiced, rehearsed. Every step, every glance was intentional. Years of operating in high-stakes environments had taught her to control not only her surroundings but also the way people perceived her. And yet, in this moment, she felt something unfamiliar prickling at the edges of her carefully constructed poise, unease. She wasn't nervous about the flight. Flying had become second nature to her, just another routine in a life spent chasing down leads, attending classified meetings, and walking through security checkpoints like this one. But today was different. Today, she wasn't traveling under an alias. No disguises, no false identities. For once, she was Aaliyah Bennett, Director of Counterterrorism for the CIA, and she was traveling home after a long and grueling series of operations overseas. She should have felt relieved. Instead, her stomach churned. It wasn't fear. Aaliyah had faced down warlords, interrogated terrorists, and sat across from men whose eyes held nothing but cold, calculated violence. What bothered her was the attention, or rather, the wrong kind of attention. She saw it the moment she entered the terminal. The glances that lingered a little too long, the subtle shifts in posture as people moved aside or turned away. She knew what it meant. She'd seen it her whole life. The sharp edges of suspicion disguised as curiosity. The unspoken assumptions that followed her wherever she went. She'd grown used to it, learned to rise above it, but today it felt heavier. The checkpoint loomed ahead, bright lights and metal detectors forming a barrier between her and her gate. She tightened her grip on her carry-on and stepped forward. The line moved slowly, and as she waited, she glanced at the TSA officers stationed nearby. Most looked bored, barely glancing up from their monitors. But one caught her eye. He stood apart from the others, arms crossed over his chest, scanning the crowd like a predator looking for prey. Officer Daniel Kent was having a bad day. At least, that's what he told himself. The truth was, Daniel's days had all started feeling the same, long, frustrating, and filled with people who, in his eyes, didn't belong. The job had worn him down over the years. He told himself he was just doing his duty, keeping the country safe. But deep down, he knew better. He wasn't just tired. He was angry at the system, at the politics, at the people he saw walking through these gates every day, acting entitled, acting like rules didn't apply to them. And when his eyes landed on Aaliyah, something snapped. She walked with too much confidence, dressed too well, looking like someone who had never had to fight for a thing in her life. He didn't see the years of sacrifice, the endless nights of work, the battles she had fought and won to get to where she was. He didn't see the countless lives she had saved or the threats she had neutralized. All he saw was a woman who didn't fit the mold of what he thought power looked like. And that made her a threat. Aaliyah noticed him the moment his gaze settled on her. She felt it like a weight pressing down on her back, but she didn't flinch. She stepped forward, handed over her ID, and waited. "Step aside," Kent said, his voice sharp and cold. She blinked. "Excuse me?" "Step aside for a secondary screening." Her jaw tightened. "Is there a reason?" "You can either step aside, or I can make you step aside." The words hit like a slap. The line behind her fell silent. She could feel the stares, the judgment, the quiet calculations of everyone watching. She took a breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "This is a mistake," she said. "Check my ID again." "I don't need to check it again," Kent snapped. "Hands where I can see them." The world tilted. She tried to reason with him, to explain, but it was too late. The grip on her arm was firm, pulling her out of line and into the center of the terminal where everyone could see. Her belongings were dumped out in front of her, her wallet, her documents, her badge. For a moment, there was silence. Then the whispers started. "Is she an agent? Did he just grab her like that?" Aaliyah didn't move. She didn't fight. She stood there, letting the weight of the moment sink in, letting Kent feel the full force of what he had done. And when he finally looked down and saw the badge, his face drained of color. But it didn't matter. The damage was already done. Phones were out, recording every second. The crowd was restless, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Kent's arrogance faltered, replaced by panic, but it was too late for apologies. Aaliyah stared at him, her voice low but sharp. "You're going to regret this." The words lingered, heavy with promise. And as she stepped forward, reclaiming her authority, Kent felt his world begin to crack. But he had no idea just how far it was about to fall. The echoes of murmurs lingered in the air long after Aaliyah stepped away from the scene, leaving Officer Daniel Kent standing frozen in disbelief. His heart pounded against his ribs as he looked down at the badge in his trembling hand. CIA. The letters glared back at him, sharp and unforgiving, as if mocking every decision he had made in the last 5 minutes. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. The crowd hadn't dispersed. Phones were still pointed in his direction, capturing his humiliation frame by frame. His palms were damp, his mind racing through excuses, explanations, anything to make this go away. But deep down, he already knew the truth. It wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. Aaliyah kept walking, her heels clicking with the same deliberate rhythm, but this time the sound felt heavier. Her pulse hadn't slowed, and her hands still shook slightly despite her composed exterior. She clenched her jaw, refusing to let the anger bubbling inside her take control. She needed to breathe, to think. The confrontation wasn't over. Not yet. "Ma'am," a voice called behind her, hesitant. It was Kent. She stopped but didn't turn. "Ma'am, please," he said again, softer this time. I need to explain. She pivoted slowly, her eyes sharp and unforgiving. Explain. Her voice cut through the noise like glass. You want to explain why you just put your hands on me? Why you humiliated me in front of an entire airport without cause? His face was red, beads of sweat forming along his hairline. I didn't know who you were, he stammered. And that justifies what you did? No, look, I was doing my job. You have to understand, I understand perfectly, she interrupted, her voice steady but lethal. You saw a black woman in heels and a suit and assumed she didn't belong. That's what I understand. It wasn't like that, he said quickly, but the words felt hollow even to him. Wasn't it? She stepped closer, her presence towering over him despite their similar height. You didn't see a threat. You saw an opportunity to assert your power, and you took it without hesitation. And now you're panicking because you didn't expect me to have power of my own. The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension that hadn't dissipated. Kent's eyes darted toward the phone still recording. He lowered his voice. Can we talk about this somewhere private? No, she said without hesitation. You lost the right to privacy the moment you dragged me into the middle of this terminal and treated me like a criminal. Kent's breath hitched, and for the first time, his voice cracked. Please. My job, my family, think about them. Her eyes narrowed. Did you think about mine? Did you think about what it means for someone like me to work twice as hard just to be seen as competent? To walk into rooms full of men who look like you and prove myself over and over again? Did you think about what it costs me to hold this badge and wear this title, only to be reduced to nothing in a matter of seconds because someone decided I didn't belong? His shoulders slumped, the weight of her words pressing down like a hammer. I made a mistake, he whispered. No, she corrected him. You made a decision. Kent opened his mouth to speak, but Aaliyah held up a hand, silencing him. She didn't need to hear another word. She had spent her life hearing excuses, justifications, and hollow apologies. What she needed now wasn't words, it was action. Turning away, she walked toward the gate, leaving Kent standing there under the weight of the stares and whispers. But the tension didn't leave her body. Not yet. She knew this wasn't the end. By the time she reached her seat on the plane, her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant. News of the incident had already reached the higher-ups. There were questions. Concerns. And, most of all, expectations. Her fingers hovered over the screen before typing a single response. Handle it. As the plane taxied down the runway, Aaliyah stared out the window, the city lights shrinking beneath her. The confrontation had been humiliating, but it wasn't new. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to put her in her place, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, something was different. This time, there were witnesses. Cameras. Evidence. And this time, she wasn't going to let it go. Back in the airport, Kent paced the hallway outside the security checkpoint, his mind spiraling. He knew the videos would go viral. He knew complaints would pour in. And he knew what came next. Suspension. An investigation. Maybe even termination. His stomach churned. He couldn't lose this job. He needed this job. Grabbing his phone, he dialed his supervisor, but the call went straight to voicemail. Panic clawed at his chest. He needed to fix this, and he needed to fix it fast. But as the minutes ticked by, his options started to narrow. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, a new fear began to creep in. What if this wasn't just about his job? What if this woman, this CIA agent, had the power to do far more damage than that? The realization hit him hard. He wasn't dealing with just anyone. He had crossed the wrong person. And as the weight of that truth settled over him, Kent felt the ground shift beneath his feet. But what would Aaliyah do next? How far was she willing to go? And just how much was Kent about to lose? The answers were coming. And they weren't going to be easy to face. Kent's hands trembled as they gripped the edges of the desk in the dimly lit conference room. The walls around him felt like they were closing in, pressing tighter with each passing second. His uniform, once crisp and commanding, now felt suffocating. The sweat beneath his collar spread, darkening the fabric and betraying the panic rising inside him. He wiped his palms against his thighs, but they didn't stop shaking. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee, a combination that churned his stomach even more than the sinking realization of what was happening. The videos were everywhere now. His phone buzzed incessantly, texts, emails, missed calls, and each notification felt heavier than the last. The headlines screamed accusations: racist cop humiliates CIA official at airport, and, caught on camera, officer assaults black CIA director. It wasn't just the media. Social media had turned him into the enemy overnight. Comments poured in by the thousands, each one sharper than the last. People demanded his resignation, his arrest, his humiliation. Others called for him to be stripped of his pension and barred from ever wearing a badge again. He had seen his face plastered across news stations, the shaky phone footage playing on repeat. Each replayed second drove the knife deeper into his gut. His heart pounded against his ribs, each beat heavier than the last. Kent couldn't think straight. He had rehearsed explanations in his head all night, reasons, excuses, defenses, but none of them sounded right. None of them sounded good enough. He looked at the door, waiting, dreading the moment it opened. The sound of heels against the linoleum echoed outside, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the stillness. Kent's stomach dropped. The door creaked open, and Aaliyah stepped inside. She didn't pause or hesitate. She moved with the same commanding presence she had at the airport, except now there was no crowd to witness it. It was just the two of them, and somehow, that made it worse. She closed the door behind her, slow and deliberate, letting the silence stretch. She didn't sit. She didn't need to. Her presence alone filled the room, overpowering the stale air and pressing down on Kent's already weakened composure. She dropped her bag onto the table, the sound echoing louder than it should have. "You have no idea what you've done," she said finally, her voice measured but sharp. Her eyes, steady and unrelenting, bore into him, making it impossible to look away. Kent's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I asked you a question earlier," she continued, stepping closer. "Do you remember what it was?" Kent's mind scrambled, trying to piece together the chaotic memories of the day before. The crowd. The badge. The silence that followed. He swallowed hard. "You asked if I knew who you were," he said quietly. "Exactly," she said, her tone cutting. "And you didn't. But you knew enough, didn't you? You knew what I looked like. That was all you needed to make your decision." Kent's jaw tightened, shame burning through him. "Do you know what I do?" she asked, her words steady but heavy. He shook his head, unsure whether the truth or a lie would make things worse. "I find threats," she said. "I identify patterns, weaknesses, vulnerabilities. And right now, Daniel, you're a vulnerability. Not just to this department but to every officer who wears that uniform the right way." Her words hit like a sledgehammer. He opened his mouth to speak, but she didn't give him the chance. "You thought this was about losing your job," she said, stepping closer until her shadow fell over him. "You thought this was about the headlines and the videos. You're wrong. This isn't about your job. This is about what comes next." Kent's breath quickened. "What do you mean?" Aaliyah leaned in slightly, her voice lowering but gaining weight. "I mean you're not going to walk away from this untouched. But whether you walk away at all depends on what you're willing to do right now." Panic flared in his chest. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said quickly, desperation leaking into his voice. Her expression didn't soften. You're going to fix this, she said, her words sharp and deliberate. Not for me. For every single person who's ever been in my position and didn't have the power to stop it. Kent swallowed hard. How? You like power, don't you? She said, her voice calm but cutting. You like control. That's why you did what you did back there. Well, now you're going to use it for something useful. I don't, you're going to become the face of accountability, she said, stepping even closer. You're going to stand in front of the cameras and own what you did. No excuses, no defenses. And then you're going to make sure every officer in this department understands exactly why it happened and what it cost you. Kent's eyes widened in horror. You're asking me to destroy myself. No, she said, her voice unwavering. I'm asking you to fix what you broke. The choice is yours. Kent's throat felt tight, his mind spinning. And if I refuse? Her gaze didn't waver. Then I'll make sure this follows you for the rest of your life, she said. Every job application, every background check, every internet search. You won't just lose your badge, you'll lose your identity. And you'll never get it back. His chest heaved, panic bubbling to the surface. You can't do that. Try me, she said. Kent slumped back into the chair, defeated. What do you want me to say? Her lips pressed into a thin line. The truth. All of it. The room fell silent again as her words settled. Kent leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. The walls felt closer now, the air heavier. He had no way out. Aaliyah turned to leave but paused at the door. One more thing, she said, glancing back. You're going to apologize. And this time, you're going to mean it. She stepped out, leaving Kent alone with his thoughts, his shame, and the crushing reality that his life as he knew it had just ended. But there was still more to come. What happened next would leave everyone watching speechless. Kent's breath came in shallow bursts as the door clicked shut behind her, leaving him alone in the suffocating room. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. The walls felt closer, the weight of her words pressing down harder with every passing second. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, his fingers catching in the sweat-soaked strands. Everything was spiraling. His job, his reputation, his entire identity, all of it teetering on the edge of collapse. He reached for his phone, his hands still shaking, scrolling through the endless flood of notifications. Emails from the department. Missed calls from his supervisor. News alerts with headlines that made his stomach turn. He couldn't focus. He couldn't breathe. His finger hovered over the call button. He thought about dialing his wife, but what could he even say? How could he explain this? How could he make her understand what he had done, what he had allowed himself to become? He dropped the phone, the clatter echoing in the empty room. The sound made him flinch. Everything felt too loud, too sharp. He closed his eyes, but all he could see was her face, the unflinching determination in her eyes, the calm precision of her words as she dismantled him piece by piece. She wasn't angry. She was controlled. Calculated. And that terrified him more than anything. The door creaked open again, and his head snapped up. Aaliyah stepped back inside, her expression unreadable. She didn't sit. She didn't need to. Her presence filled the room, just like before, but this time, something was different. This time, Kent could feel the power shift more than he ever had before. You're still here, she said, her voice steady but sharp. He swallowed hard. Don't, she interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't start with excuses. Don't try to explain yourself again. That time has passed. Kent felt his mouth go dry. I gave you an option, she continued, stepping closer. I laid it out for you. But now I need to know, are you ready to do what I asked, or are you going to keep pretending this will all just go away? He hesitated, his throat tightening. I'll do it, he said quickly, his voice cracking. "I'll do what you asked. Just tell me how." Aaliyah didn't move, didn't blink. Her eyes stayed locked on his, searching, measuring. "I need more than words," she said finally. "I need you to understand what this means. No half measures, no apologies filled with excuses. You're not walking out of this with your pride intact. You're not walking out of this as the same man who walked into that airport yesterday. That man is gone. Do you understand that?" Kent nodded, but she didn't look satisfied. "No," she said, stepping even closer, her voice low but sharp. "I need to hear you say it. Do you understand what this is going to cost you?" His chest tightened. He could barely find his voice. "I understand." "Do you?" she shot back. "Because I don't think you do. I don't think you've even begun to process what's coming next. You think this ends with a press conference? A statement? That's not enough. Not anymore. You're going to feel this. Every single day, you're going to feel this. And I need to know you're ready for that." His breathing quickened. "I don't have a choice," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Yes, you do," she said sharply. "You always had a choice. You chose to treat me the way you did. And now you're choosing this. Don't pretend this is happening to you. Own it." Kent's shoulders slumped. "I'll do it," he said again, quieter this time. "I'll own it." Aaliyah's gaze softened just slightly, but the steel in her voice didn't waver. "You're going to meet me tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. sharp. The press will be there. The cameras will be rolling. And you're going to stand next to me and tell the truth. All of it. No defenses, no excuses. Do you understand?" He nodded again. "Say it." "I understand," he said, louder this time. Her eyes lingered on his for another moment, and then she turned to leave. But before she reached the door, she paused. "One more thing," she said without looking back. "You're not doing this for me. You're doing this for every person who has ever been where I was in that moment, helpless, humiliated, treated like less than human because someone decided they didn't belong. You're doing this for them. So don't think for a second this is about saving yourself." The door closed behind her, and Kent sank back into the chair. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. Everything she had said echoed in his ears, each word hitting harder than the last. He had agreed, but the weight of what he had just committed to felt unbearable. Sleep didn't come that night. He stared at the ceiling for hours, the glow of his phone lighting up the room as notifications continued to pour in. By morning, his nerves were shot, and his stomach churned violently as he put on his uniform one last time. The press conference was already swarming with reporters when he arrived. Cameras flashed as he stepped out of the car, his legs trembling. Aaliyah was already there, poised and commanding as always, her eyes meeting his the moment he stepped into view. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. He stepped up to the podium, his hands gripping the edges like a lifeline. The cameras pointed at him felt like guns. He took a deep breath, the words Aaliyah had drilled into him circling in his mind. He had no idea if he could get through this. But he had no choice. And as the room fell silent, waiting for him to speak, he felt the weight of the world pressing down, and the knowledge that nothing he said would ever be enough. Kent's palms were slick with sweat as he gripped the podium. The flashes from the cameras felt like tiny explosions, bursts of light that burned into his vision. His throat was dry, and no matter how many times he swallowed, the tightness wouldn't go away. The crowd of reporters stared back at him, pens ready, microphones pointed like weapons. Behind them, more cameras rolled, capturing every tremble in his voice, every bead of sweat trailing down his face. Aaliyah stood just a few steps to his right, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the crowd, steady and focused, as though she had already prepared herself for whatever storm this moment would bring. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing tighter with each second of silence. He cleared his throat and leaned closer to the microphone. His voice wavered at first, barely louder than a whisper. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," he began, but the words felt hollow, empty, like paper crumbling in his hands. He saw the reporter's eyes narrow, waiting for more. He gripped the podium harder. "I need to say that I made a terrible mistake. No, not a mistake, a decision. A wrong decision. I allowed my biases to cloud my judgment, and I acted without thinking, without questioning my actions, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." He paused, his chest tightening. The cameras clicked, and he felt their focus zeroing in on every word. He forced himself to continue. "What I did was unacceptable. It wasn't just an error in judgment, it was an abuse of power, and I take full responsibility for that abuse." His voice cracked, and he looked toward Aaliyah. She didn't move. She didn't nod or give any sign of approval. She just waited. The weight of her presence made it impossible to stop now. "I know an apology can't undo what I did," he said, his voice thick. "It can't erase the humiliation I caused, and it can't erase the history of moments like this happening to people who look like her, who look like so many others, over and over again. But what I can do is acknowledge it, own it, and do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't happen again. Not by me, and not by anyone else who wears this uniform." The room went silent. For the first time, Kent felt the gravity of his words sinking in. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, the skepticism, the anger, and the exhaustion etched into so many of them. Aaliyah finally stepped forward. The subtle click of her heels was the only sound in the room as she approached the microphone. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "What happened at the airport wasn't an isolated incident," she said, her tone sharp and unyielding. "What you saw wasn't just about one man making a bad decision. It was about a culture, a pattern, that has allowed these kinds of abuses to go unchecked for far too long. That ends today." Kent flinched at the finality in her words, but she didn't look at him. Her focus was entirely on the crowd. "This isn't just about apologies," she continued. "It's about accountability. It's about consequences. And it's about change, real, measurable change. Not words. Actions." She turned slightly, her gaze finally landing on Kent. "And that starts here. Today." Kent's stomach churned as he felt every eye in the room shift back to him. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and escape the suffocating weight of the moment. But there was nowhere to run. After the conference ended, Kent could barely hear the noise around him. Reporters shouted questions, flashes blinded him, and voices blurred together into an overwhelming hum. He followed Aaliyah out of the room, his legs feeling heavy and unsteady. In the hallway, away from the cameras, she stopped abruptly and turned to face him. "It's not over," she said, her voice low but firm. He looked at her, his shoulders sagging. "What else do you want from me?" "I want you to understand something," she said. "What you did today wasn't enough. It was a start, but it's not enough. Not yet." His chest tightened. "So what happens now?" "You're going to learn," she said. "You're going to sit in meetings, trainings, discussions, whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen again. And not just for you. For the people who work with you. For the people who trust you to do your job right." Kent's stomach twisted. "And if I fail?" She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Then you lose everything. And this time, no one will step in to stop it." Her words hung in the air like a threat, but Kent knew it wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. He left the building that day feeling like a man walking a tightrope over an endless drop. The weight of what he had done, and what he still had to do, pressed down on him with every step. He knew the world would keep watching, waiting to see if he would stumble. Back in her office, Aaliyah sat alone, the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. She stared at the news reports flooding in, the videos, the commentary, the endless debates. None of it felt like victory. Not yet. She knew this wasn't the end of the fight. Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant. Another request for an interview. Another network wanting her voice, her perspective. She exhaled slowly, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing a response. Not yet. She needed time to think, to plan, to make sure this wasn't just another story that faded into the background. It couldn't be. This had to matter. It had to mean something. As she leaned back in her chair, the weight of the moment lingered. She wasn't finished. Neither was he. And the world was still watching. Kent sat alone in the break room of the precinct, his hands wrapped tightly around a half-empty cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The walls around him felt smaller than usual, the hum of the vending machines and fluorescent lights almost deafening in the quiet. He stared blankly at the surface of the table, the scratches and stains suddenly more interesting than anything happening outside this room. His phone sat face down next to him, buzzing occasionally with notifications he had stopped checking hours ago. He knew what they said, more fallout, more outrage, more reminders of everything he had become overnight. He didn't look up when the door opened. He didn't have to. The sharp click of heels against the tile floor told him exactly who it was. Aaliyah stepped inside, her movements precise and deliberate. She didn't hesitate. She didn't need to. The room shifted the moment she entered, her presence commanding attention even when she wasn't asking for it. Kent's grip tightened on the cup as he felt her eyes settle on him. "You look like hell." Her voice wasn't sharp this time, but it carried the same weight, the same authority that made his stomach twist. He wanted to answer, to say something that didn't sound weak or desperate, but his mouth was dry, and the words wouldn't come. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "I haven't slept." She didn't move closer. She didn't sit. She stayed near the door, arms crossed, her gaze steady. "Good. You shouldn't be sleeping. Not after what you did." Her words hit him harder than he expected, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. He set the cup down, his fingers leaving faint smudges of sweat on the paper. "I did what you asked. The press conference, the statement, I did it." And? Her eyebrows lifted slightly, the challenge clear in her voice. "Do you think that's enough? Do you think one speech erases what happened in that terminal? Do you think it erases what people saw?" "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "No, I don't." "Then why do you sound like you're waiting for a medal?" He felt his shoulders sag, the weight of her words pressing down harder than before. "I'm not," he said quietly. "I'm just trying to figure out what happens next." "What happens next," she repeated, her tone sharp again. "What happens next is that you keep showing up. Every single day. You show up, and you prove to everyone watching that you understand what you did and why it matters. You don't get to walk away from this. Not now. Not ever." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Kent leaned back in his chair, running a hand down his face. "I'm trying," he said finally. "But every time I think about it, every time I close my eyes, all I see is me," she finished for him, stepping closer now. "You see me, standing there with my hands up, trying to tell you who I was while you decided I didn't matter." He swallowed again, his throat dry. "Yes. Good." Her voice softened, but only slightly. "You should see it. You should feel it, because that's the only way this works. If you can't face it, then none of this means anything." Kent's chest tightened as he looked up at her. "I'm scared," he admitted, the words feeling foreign as they left his mouth. "Not of losing my job, not of the cameras or the headlines, I'm scared of what comes next. I don't know how to fix this. For the first time, Aaliyah's expression shifted. It wasn't pity, but something close to understanding. "You don't fix this," she said quietly. "That's not how this works. You don't get to fix it. You get to carry it. You get to carry it with you for the rest of your life and hope that carrying it is enough to stop the next person like you from doing what you did." Her words hit hard, settling in the pit of his stomach like a stone. He wanted to argue, to push back, but he knew she was right. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and no amount of apologies would change that. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to look at her. "And what about you? What about me? How do you carry it?" Aaliyah's eyes softened, just for a moment, before the steel returned. "I carry it the same way I always have. One day at a time." Kent nodded, letting her words settle before speaking again. "What if I can't do it?" "Then you don't deserve to be here," she said without hesitation. The words hit like a punch, but this time, Kent didn't flinch. He let them sink in, let them settle. He had spent his entire career thinking strength came from power, from control, but now he saw it for what it really was, facing what you'd done, owning it, and choosing to keep going even when it felt impossible. Aaliyah turned to leave, but she stopped at the door, her hand resting on the handle. "You'll show up tomorrow at the training," she said without looking back. "Don't be late." Kent didn't answer. He just nodded, even though she couldn't see it. The door closed behind her, and for the first time in days, Kent let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The room was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. Not anymore. It felt heavy, like something had shifted, like something had cracked open inside him that couldn't be put back together. Aaliyah stepped outside into the hall, her heels echoing against the tile. She exhaled, her fingers tightening briefly around the strap of her bag before she let it go. She had spent years learning how to carry moments like this, how to absorb the weight and keep moving forward, but this one felt different. This one felt bigger. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, another notification lighting up the screen. She ignored it. She wasn't done yet. Not with him. Not with this. Kent would show up tomorrow. She knew he would. But whether he'd be ready for what came next, that was the real question. And for the first time, she wasn't sure of the answer. Kent sat in the back row of the training room, his back rigid against the stiff plastic chair. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation and unspoken judgments. The other officers filled the rows in front of him, some leaning back with their arms crossed, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. He could feel their eyes on him even when they weren't looking directly. The whispers hadn't stopped since he walked in. He could hear them behind him, low voices that carried sharp edges, words like disgrace and embarrassment slipping through the cracks. His hands rested on his knees, but his fingers twitched, restless and anxious. He hated this feeling, the weight of being watched, dissected, and judged, but he forced himself to sit there, to endure it. The room fell silent as Aaliyah entered. She didn't hesitate, didn't pause to acknowledge the stares or the tension that tightened the air like a noose. Her heels clicked against the linoleum floor, sharp and deliberate, and she carried herself with the same authority that had shattered Kent's sense of control in the airport. She moved to the front of the room, setting her papers down on the table, and scanned the crowd with a gaze that made people shift in their seats. "Let's be clear about something before we start." Her voice was calm, but it sliced through the silence with precision. "This isn't just another training session. This isn't about ticking boxes or covering liability. This is about accountability. And if you're here thinking this doesn't apply to you, then you're already part of the problem." Her words lingered, settling heavily over the room. Kent swallowed hard, his throat dry as he saw a few officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, a younger man in the second row, raised his hand. "So what is this, then? A public shaming?" He tried to sound confident, but there was an edge to his voice. "Are we supposed to sit here and act like we're the bad guys?" Aaliyah didn't flinch. She stepped closer to the table, her eyes locking on his. This isn't about shame. It's about responsibility. It's about looking at yourself and asking whether you're willing to admit your flaws and do the work to fix them. And if you can't do that, then maybe you shouldn't be wearing that badge. The officer shifted but didn't respond. Kent felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the chair and vanish, but Aaliyah's gaze moved toward him, and he knew he couldn't. He straightened slightly, forcing himself to hold her eyes even as his stomach twisted. Some of you think what happened at that airport was an isolated incident, Aaliyah said, her voice steady. Some of you think it was just one mistake, one moment that got blown out of proportion. But let me tell you something, what happened that day wasn't about one bad decision. It was about a pattern. It was about assumptions and biases that go unchecked until they explode in moments like that. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. And those moments have consequences. Real consequences. Lives are changed, careers are destroyed, and trust is broken. And the only way we fix it is by acknowledging that it exists in the first place. Another officer raised his hand, an older man this time. So what do you expect us to do? Walk on eggshells? Second guess every decision we make? No, Aaliyah said without hesitation. I expect you to think. To look beyond what you assume and question your instincts. To ask yourself whether what you're doing is about safety, or control. Because if you can't tell the difference, then you have no business being in this uniform. The silence that followed was louder than the whispers had been. Kent shifted in his seat, his pulse pounding. He knew this wasn't just about the other officers. It was about him. Every word she spoke felt aimed at him, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, he couldn't. Aaliyah turned back to the table, pulling out a stack of papers and passing them down the rows. These are case studies, she said. Real incidents, just like what happened at the airport. You're going to read them, analyze them, and talk about what went wrong and what should have happened instead. And we're going to keep doing this until you understand what accountability really means. The papers made their way back to Kent, and his eyes scanned the top sheet. It was his case. His name printed in bold letters, followed by a breakdown of every mistake he had made. His stomach twisted, and for a moment, he thought about getting up and leaving. But then he looked up and met Aaliyah's eyes. She didn't say anything, but the message was clear. Stay. Face it. The room buzzed with murmurs as the officers read through the papers, but Kent barely heard them. His eyes traced the words over and over, each sentence a reminder of what he had done. The facts were laid out in brutal detail, his actions, the assumptions he had made, the consequences that had followed. As the discussion started, voices rose and fell around him. Some defended him, saying it could have happened to anyone. Others were harsher, calling it negligence, bias, incompetence. Kent felt every word like a blow, but he forced himself to stay, to listen. When Aaliyah spoke again, the room fell silent. Accountability doesn't stop at admitting you were wrong, she said. It doesn't stop at apologies or press conferences. It's about what you do after. It's about showing up and doing the work, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. Her eyes met Kent's again, and this time, there was something different, something heavier. You don't get to decide when this ends, she said. That's not up to you. It's up to the people you hurt. Kent swallowed hard. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just nodded, the weight of her words settling deep into his chest. The session ended, but the weight didn't lift. Kent stayed in his seat long after the others had left, staring at the paper in front of him. He felt raw, exposed, but also something else, something he hadn't felt in days. Determination. As he finally stood and walked toward the door, he saw Aaliyah waiting in the hallway. She didn't speak, but her eyes said enough. Keep showing up, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. That's the only way forward. Kent nodded and stepped past her, the weight still heavy but no longer unbearable. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't done yet. Kent stood outside the precinct, his shoulders squared but his chest still heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. The cold evening air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was too tangled in the chaos of the last few weeks, the endless headlines, the harsh questions, the faces of his colleagues who had either turned away or stared too long. He felt the judgment in their silence, but worse than that, he felt the judgment in his own reflection. He had spent years convincing himself he was one of the good ones, the kind of cop who followed the rules, who didn't let biases get in the way of his duty. But that illusion had shattered in seconds. Now he was left to pick up the pieces and figure out if there was even anything worth saving. Aaliyah watched him from a distance, leaning against the doorway with her arms crossed. She hadn't spoken to him since the press conference, hadn't given him any indication of where things stood. That was intentional. She needed to see what he would do when no one was holding his hand, when no one was guiding him. She needed to know whether he was capable of standing on his own or if he would crumble under the pressure. When he finally turned and saw her, there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, but then he straightened, as if bracing himself for another battle. He walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate, as though he knew this moment mattered just as much as every word he had spoken in front of the cameras. "I didn't think you'd be here," he said, his voice quieter than she expected. She didn't move. "I'm always here. The work doesn't stop just because the cameras do." Kent swallowed, his gaze dropping for just a second before he forced it back up. "I meant it," he said. "What I said up there, I meant it." "Good," she replied, her tone sharp but not cruel. "Because meaning it isn't enough. Now you have to prove it." He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "And what if I screw up?" "You will," she said without hesitation. "But what matters is what you do after." The words hit him harder than he expected. He nodded, his jaw tightening as he tried to steady himself. "I don't want to be that guy anymore," he admitted. "The one who looks first and assumes the worst. I don't want to be him, but I don't know how to stop." Aaliyah studied him carefully, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "You start by listening," she said. "You listen to the people who've been where I was, who've felt what I felt. You let yourself be uncomfortable, and you don't run from it." Kent nodded again, but she could see the doubt still lingering in his eyes. "It's not going to happen overnight," she continued. "It's not going to be easy. And it's not going to be clean. Change never is. But you don't get to quit just because it's hard. You don't get to walk away when it gets messy." He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "And what if I fail?" "Then you get back up," she said. "And you keep trying." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting, but Kent didn't flinch this time. He just stood there, letting them settle. Aaliyah turned toward the door, but before she stepped inside, she paused and looked back at him. "Tomorrow. Same time. Don't be late." And then she was gone, leaving Kent alone with the cold and the echoes of her words. Inside her office, Aaliyah dropped her bag onto her desk and sank into her chair. The room was dark except for the faint glow of her computer screen. She stared at the inbox filled with messages, requests for interviews, speaking engagements, follow-ups from her superiors, but she ignored them for now. She needed a moment to breathe, to process. She had spent years fighting for moments like this, moments where accountability wasn't just a word but an action, where someone like Kent had to face what he'd done and couldn't hide behind excuses. But as satisfying as it was to see progress, she knew better than to celebrate too early. Change didn't happen because of one press conference or one apology. It happened in the quiet moments, in the choices people made when no one was watching. And she wasn't sure yet if Kent was ready for that. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her assistant, a reminder about another training session scheduled for the following week. She typed out a quick response before leaning back in her chair. Her eyes drifted to the window, where the city lights glowed against the night sky. She thought about all the moments that had led her here, the long hours, the sacrifices, the battles she had fought just to prove she belonged in the spaces where people like Kent had always been welcomed without question. And she thought about the people who would never get this moment, who would never see justice, who would never get to look their oppressor in the eye and watch them fall apart. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Kent lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, but he ignored it. The weight of the day, of the weeks before it, felt heavier now than ever. He thought about the faces in the training room, the anger, the skepticism, the disbelief. He thought about Aaliyah's words, sharp and precise, cutting through his defenses every time he tried to justify what he had done. But most of all, he thought about what came next. This story isn't just about one man's fall from grace. It's about what happens after. It's about what it means to face the consequences of your actions and choose to do better. It's about accountability, not as a punishment, but as a process, a commitment to change that doesn't end when the cameras turn off. So ask yourself, what would you do if you were in Kent's shoes? Would you fight to fix what you broke, even if it meant facing your worst mistakes? Or would you walk away, hoping the world would forget? And what about Aaliyah? How many times has someone like her had to fight just to be seen, just to be heard? How many times has someone like her had to carry the weight of someone else's ignorance? This story isn't just theirs. It's ours. It's about the choices we make, the assumptions we hold, and the courage it takes to face them head-on. What did this story make you feel? Did it make you angry? Did it make you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're ready for more stories that challenge and inspire, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.